A husky didn't wander into Daniel Forsythe's life so much as get thrown into it by a February storm that had no business being that cruel to a place like Halifax. He found her. Or rather, his neighbor found her and called him because everyone on the street still remembered what Daniel used to be, even if Daniel himself had spent 3 years trying to forget it. She was wedged behind a dumpster off Agricola Street, one back leg bent wrong, a chain still bolted to a collar that had cut a permanent groove into her neck. Frostbite had already taken the tip of one ear. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. She just watched him with eyes the color of weak tea and waited to see what kind of man he was going to be. Daniel was 46, built like a man who used to carry 80 pounds of gear up mountainsides, and now mostly carried groceries up 2 flights of stairs to an apartment he kept too clean and too empty. 17 years in the Navy, the last 6 of them in places he didn't talk about, ending in a deployment that gave him back his body, but not the rest of him. His wife Eleanor used to say he came home from the war fine, and then, 18 months after the funeral of the man he called his brother, not blood, just the kind of brother you only get from nearly dying together, Eleanor herself got sick and was gone within the year. After that, Daniel stopped fixing things that broke. He stopped answering his phone before 9 a.m. He stopped, mostly, talking. The neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Phyllis Okonkwo, who fed every stray cat on the block whether the city liked it or not, banged on his door at 6:30 in the morning with snow still coming down sideways. "There's a dog back of my recycling bins and she won't move and I can't lift her myself," Phyllis said, not as a question. "You're the only one on this street who'd know what to do with a frightened animal." He almost said no. He had said no to nearly everything for 3 years. But something about the word frightened, not hurt, not abandoned, frightened, pulled at the part of him that used to be useful. She weighed maybe 40 pounds, soaking wet, and she was soaking wet. Daniel crouched in the alley with his coat already ruined and talked to her the way he used to talk to the dogs in his unit. Low and even, no sudden movements, no promises couldn't keep. It took 11 minutes before she let him touch her. It took another 4 before she let him lift her. By the time he got her into his truck, his hands had stopped shaking for the first time he could remember. The vet, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Imogen Castellano, who ran the only emergency clinic open during the storm, looked at the dog's leg, the collar scar, the malnourishment, and then looked at Daniel like she already knew his whole story without him saying a word. "She's maybe 2 years old. The leg's fractured, not shattered. She'll walk again, might always favor it a little. Whoever had her chained her up and left her in weather like this more than once. This isn't the first storm she's survived alone." Dr. Castellano paused, pen tapping against her clipboard. "You're not planning on dropping her at the shelter once she's patched up, are you?" It wasn't a question either. Daniel looked through the glass at the trembling shape on the table and surprised himself by saying, "No." He named her Brisk, because that was the word that came to him watching her shiver, and because somewhere in him he liked the idea of something brisk coming back into a life that had gone so still. The first weeks were not gentle. Brisk flinched at raised hands, at the clatter of pots, at the particular creak of his apartment door when it opened too fast. She wouldn't eat if he stood too close to the bowl. She slept against the wall farthest from him, the cast on her leg dragging awkwardly across the floor. And some nights he'd wake at 3 a.m. to find her sitting upright in the dark, watching the door like she was still waiting for someone to come back and finish what they started. He understood that particular kind of waiting better than he wanted to admit. Daniel had been assigned, back in the service, to the K-9 program for 2 years before his final deployment, not as a handler exactly, but enough that he knew the language of a frightened working dog, the difference between a dog that had never been loved and one that had been loved and lost it. Brisk was the second kind. Someone had handled her gently once. He could tell by the way she leaned, just slightly, toward an open palm before catching herself and pulling back. It was Phyllis who pushed him to take Brisk to the dog park down by the harbor once the cast came off, insisting that the dog needed other dogs, and that Daniel, whether he liked it or not, needed other people. He went mostly to prove her wrong. Instead, he met Reuben Achterberg, a barrel-chested harbor pilot with 2 ancient Labradors, and an easy laugh that filled silences Daniel didn't know how to fill himself. and Reuben's daughter Sawarse, 12 years old and entirely unbothered by adult awkwardness, who marched straight up to Brisk with a tennis ball like the dog owed her a game. Brisk, who hadn't approached a stranger in 6 weeks, took 3 steps toward the girl and sat. "She likes you," Daniel said, startled. "Dogs always like me," Sorcy said, like it was the most obvious fact in the world. "Mom says I smell like safe." Reuben laughed at that, the kind of laugh that came easy to a man who hadn't spent years training himself not to make noise. "Don't mind her. She's been telling people they smell like things since she was 4. He studied Daniel a beat longer than was comfortable. "You're the fella from the news last spring, aren't you? Coast Guard rescue, the capsized fishing boat off Eastern Passage." Daniel's jaw tightened. He hated being recognized for that, hated the way people's faces changed when they remembered, like he was something to be careful around. "Long time ago. 8 months isn't that long," Reuben said, not unkindly. "My cousin was on that boat. You want a coffee sometime, you let me know. No agenda. Just coffee." Daniel didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either, and for him that was practically an invitation engraved in gold. Spring came late that year, the way it always does on the East Coast, but it came. Brisk's limp faded to something only Daniel noticed. She started sleeping closer to the bed instead of against the far wall. She learned the rhythm of his footsteps well enough to meet him at the door before his key even turned, tail going in that wide husky sweep that nearly knocked over the side table every single time. What nobody could explain, not Dr. Castellano, not the trainer Daniel eventually hired out of stubborn curiosity, not Reuben who'd had dogs his whole life, was the sound Brisk started making in April. Not quite a howl, not quite a bark. A low, rolling, almost word sound that came out whenever Daniel sat too long with his head in his hands, whenever the apartment got too quiet for too long. The trainer, a patient, weathered man named Otis Marchetti, who specialized in working dog rehabilitation, watched it happen once during a session and went very still. "Huskies do that," Otis said slowly. "Vocalize, talk back, whatever you want to call it. But I've been doing this 30 years and I've only seen a handful that did it on cue like that. Like they're trying to interrupt something. She's not making noise at you, Daniel. She's calling you back." Daniel didn't believe in things like that. He'd believed in extraction points and radio checks and the weight of a man's body when you were the one carrying him out. But the first time it happened, him sitting on the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning, 3 months after Eleanor's anniversary, the apartment so silent it roared. Brisk had walked over, put her face 6 inches from his, and made that sound, low and insistent, until he looked up, until he answered her, just to make her stop. "I'm here," he'd said out loud to a dog at 2 a.m., and something in his chest that had been clenched since a funeral in Truro finally, fractionally, let go. After that he started talking to her on purpose, not constantly, not like a man who'd lost his mind, but he'd narrate small things, the weather, what he was making for dinner, a memory of Eleanor's terrible parallel parking, and Brisk would tip her head, ears swiveling, that rolling almost word sound rising up whenever he paused too long, like she was holding her end of a conversation he hadn't realized he needed to have. Sorcy noticed it before anyone else did. She'd taken to walking over after school twice a week, ostensibly to play with Brisk, actually, Daniel suspected. Sent by Reuben on a gentle, deniable mission of neighborhood reconnaissance. "She talks to you," Sarcy said one afternoon, lying flat on her stomach on the kitchen floor while Brisk rested her chin on the girl's shoulder. "Like, actually talks. My friend Priscilla has a husky and he just screams about nothing. Brisk only does it when you go quiet." "She's smart," Daniel said. "She's worried about you," Source corrected, with the brutal clarity only a 12-year-old can manage. That's different than smart. He didn't have an answer for that one. The conflict, when it came, wasn't dramatic in the way Daniel had once been trained to expect conflict to be. There was no ambush, no gunfire, nothing his body knew how to brace for. It came instead in the form of a woman named Hazel Trent showing up at his door on a wet Tuesday in June, clutching a faded photograph and a vet record with a microchip number circled in red pen. "That's my dog," she said, before he'd even gotten the door fully open. "That's Storm. She went missing 2 years ago. Someone said there was a husky on this street." Daniel felt the floor tilt under him in a way it hadn't since the worst of his deployments. He looked past her at Brisk, who had gone rigid by the window, ears flat, that almost word sound climbing into something closer to a true cry. Not the calling sound she'd made for him, but something raw and frightened, aimed at the woman on the porch. The microchip confirmed it within the hour. Brisk, Storm, had belonged to Hazel's ex-husband, a man named Calder Trent, who'd kept the dog after the divorce, and according to the records and the photographs Hazel brought, had not been a kind keeper of anything. Hazel hadn't known where the dog ended up after she left him. She'd been looking, on and off, ever since, mostly out of guilt for not taking the dog with her when she'd had the chance. "I'm not asking for her back," Hazel said finally, sitting at Daniel's kitchen table with shaking hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. Brisk had not come near her once, had instead pressed her whole body against Daniel's leg, refusing to so much as look at the stranger. I can see she's afraid of me, and honestly, looking at her now, looking at how she is with you, I think she's exactly where she's supposed to be. I just needed to know she was alive. I needed to know somebody finally got it right." It would have been easy, Daniel thought later, for the story to end there with relief and a clean goodbye. But Hazel came back 3 days later, this time with a different kind of news. Calder, the ex-husband, had heard through a mutual friend that the dog had been found, and he was making noise about ownership. Not because he wanted Storm back, Hazel was certain, but because losing did not sit well with a man like Calder, and causing trouble was the only language he had left for grief over a marriage he still blamed everyone but himself for. It wasn't a custody battle in any legal sense. The dog had been found as a stray, no charges had ever been filed for abandonment. The law in Nova Scotia wasn't built for this kind of heartbreak, but it was, for 3 tense weeks, a battle of phone calls and a single ugly visit from Calder himself, a tall, restless man who stood on Daniel's porch with his jaw set and his hands jammed in his pockets, like he was trying to keep them from doing something he'd regret. "She's still legally mine," Calder said. "Microchips in my name." Daniel, who had spent 17 years learning exactly how much restraint a dangerous man could carry without ever using it, kept his voice level. "She ran from you once already, and ended up half frozen behind a dumpster. You want to explain to a judge how that happened, you're welcome to try." Calder didn't have an answer for that. He didn't come back. It wasn't a court that ended it, in the end. It was Reuben, of all people, who knew a lawyer who specialized in animal welfare pro bono cases, and Otis the trainer, who wrote up a formal assessment of Brisk's behavioral history that made it plain to anyone reading it exactly what kind of home she'd come from and exactly what kind of home she'd found. Faced with a paper trail and a neighborhood of witnesses, Phyllis, Reuben, Circe, even Dr. Castellano, willing to testify to Daniel's care of the dog, Calder let it go before it ever needed to go further. Some men, Daniel had learned a long time ago, only fight battles they think they can win quietly. Once it got loud, once it got documented, Calder's interest evaporated. Hazel sent one last note, slid under Daniel's door instead of handed to him, like she still wasn't sure she had the right. "Thank you for not making her afraid again. Take care of each other." Daniel kept it in the drawer with Eleanor's old recipe cards, which felt, in some way he didn't examine too closely, like the right place for it. By August, the almost word sound had become something closer to ritual. Reuben started calling it the conversation without irony, dropping by some evenings with a six-pack, and the 2 Labradors, sitting on Daniel's small back step while Brisk made her rolling sound at Daniel, and Daniel answered her. And Circe kept score of how many words she could count in a single exchange like it was a sport. Phyllis brought soup on Sundays whether anyone asked her to or not. The apartment that had been clean and bare and empty for 3 years started, slowly, to look lived in. A dog bed by the window, muddy paw prints. Daniel stopped bothering to mop up immediately. A leash hung by the door next to a jacket that wasn't ruined anymore because he'd finally bought a new one. In September, on the 1-year anniversary of Eleanor's death, Daniel did something he hadn't managed in 3 years. He sat at the kitchen table, took out the photograph that had spent so long turned face down on the shelf, and set it upright again. Brisk came and put her chin on his knee, made the low calling sound once, twice, and then simply stayed there, solid and warm and present, while he let himself cry for the first time since the funeral, the kind of crying that doesn't fix anything but loosens something all the same. Reuben found him there an hour later. He'd come by unannounced. The way he did now, the way friends do once they've decided you're worth showing up for. And instead of saying anything, he just sat down across the table, poured 2 coffees, and waited. Source, trailing behind her father, curled up on the floor with Brisk without a word, the dog's tail thumping once against the linoleum in greeting. "You don't have to talk about it," Reuben said eventually. "I know," Daniel said. And then, because the dog beside him had spent 6 months teaching him that silence wasn't always safety, that sometimes the bravest thing was the sound you let out instead of the one you swallowed, he did talk about it. About Eleanor, about the brother he'd lost overseas, whose name he still couldn't say out loud most days, about the year he'd spent waiting in an apartment for an order that wasn't coming. Reuben listened. Source, 12 and unbothered by adult grief in the way only children can be, reached over at some point and took Daniel's hand without being asked, the way she'd once let Brisk approach her. Like it was simply the obvious thing to do. Brisk, for her part, lay between them all, ears occasionally tracking the rise and fall of Daniel's voice, content for once not to interrupt the silence, because for the first time in a long while, the silence in that apartment wasn't the kind that needed interrupting. Winter came back around the way it does in Halifax, hard and early. But this time, the storm rattling the windows didn't tighten anything in Daniel's chest. He sat by the window, with a coffee gone only slightly cold, Brisk curled against his side, Reuben's truck pulling up outside with Sowers, already waving through the frosted glass. And when the wind howled around the building, Brisk lifted her head and howled back. Not the frightened cry from the porch in June, not the calling sound that used to pull him out of the dark, but something easy and full-throated and entirely her own. The sound of a dog who was no longer waiting for anyone to come back, because everyone she needed was already there. Daniel laughed, low and surprised at himself, and reached down to scratch behind the one frostbitten ear that never quite grew back right. And somewhere in that small apartment that used to be too quiet, the conversation simply continued.